The cold metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed against the sterile concrete walls, a sound that promised violence and finality. For 16-year-old Jamal Carter, it marked the shattering end to an ordinary evening that had begun with textbooks and dreams of college. Handcuffed and processed like a common criminal, his desperate pleas for a phone call were met only with mocking laughter. The officers saw a black teenager walking home and spun their own narrative of guilt around him. They had no idea the young man they had targeted and tormented was about to trigger a chain of events that would shatter their careers, their department, and their entire world. They had locked him up, convinced they were untouchable. They were wrong. 16-year-old Jamal Carter was just trying to get home. He was a junior at Crestview High, an honor student carrying a 3.9 GPA, and the starting point guard for the varsity basketball team. His backpack weighed heavily on his shoulders, stuffed with an AP Physics textbook, a graphing calculator, and a half-finished essay on the French Revolution. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of approaching rain. He had stayed late after practice to help his coach organize the equipment room, a favor that meant he was walking back to his affluent suburban neighborhood of Cedar Creek well past dusk. Cedar Creek was a quiet, manicured enclave, lawns perfectly trimmed, driveways holding expensive imported cars, and streetlights casting a warm, safe glow over the sidewalks. Jamal belonged here. He had lived in the corner house on Maplewood Drive since he was 6 years old. Yet, as a young black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood, he had learned early on that his presence sometimes triggered invisible alarms in the minds of people who didn't know him. He stopped at a local convenience store, a small mom-and-pop shop, to grab a sports drink and a pack of gum. He paid, gave the owner a polite nod, and stepped back out into the cool night air. He popped a piece of peppermint gum into his mouth and adjusted his headphones, letting the smooth rhythm of 90s hip-hop drown out the silence of the streets. 2 blocks away from his front door, the atmosphere shifted. A police cruiser, stealthily prowling the neighborhood with its headlights dimmed, suddenly accelerated. The aggressive roar of the engine pierced through Jamal's music. Before he could turn his head to assess the situation, the cruiser swerved sharply, jumping the curb and cutting off his path on the sidewalk. The blinding glare of the spotlight hit him instantly, washing out his vision and leaving him completely disoriented. "Hands out of your pockets! Do it now!" a voice barked over the cruiser's PA system. Jamal froze, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled his headphones down around his neck, blinking against the intense light. I just have my phone," he stammered, slowly raising his empty hands into the air to show he was not a threat. The driver's side door flew open, and Officer Trent Harlan stepped out. Harlan was a veteran of the force, a man whose thick neck and aggressive posture spoke volumes about his policing style. He had a reputation in the precinct for being heavy-handed, a trait he masked under the guise of being tough on crime. From the passenger side emerged his partner, Officer Bryce Nolan, a younger man trying too hard to emulate Harlan's authoritative swagger. "I said keep your hands where I can see them, boy," Harlan shouted, his hand resting menacingly on the butt of his service weapon. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, grabbing Jamal violently by the shoulder and spinning him around. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jamal cried out, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and adolescent indignation. "I live right down the street. I'm just walking home." "Shut your mouth," Nolan sneered, stepping in to grab Jamal's other arm. With unnecessary force, they slammed the teenager face first against the cold, hard metal of the cruiser's hood. The impact knocked the wind out of Jamal, his cheek pressing painfully against the damp surface. "Stop resisting," Harlan yelled, despite Jamal not moving a muscle. It was a practice phrase, shouted loud enough for any potential witnesses to hear, painting a false narrative of the encounter. "I'm not resisting. Jamal gasped, struggling to draw breath. My ID is in my backpack. My name is Jamal Carter. My house is literally 2 blocks away. Harlan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He yanked Jamal's arms behind his back, twisting his wrists until Jamal let out a sharp cry of pain. Yeah, sure it is. And I'm the King of England. We got a call about a prowler in the area matching your exact description. Black male, dark clothing, suspicious behavior. Jamal was wearing his school's varsity jacket, bright blue and gold with a massive C for Crestview stitched on the front. I'm wearing a Letterman jacket, Jamal protested, hot tears of frustration pricking the corners of his eyes. I'm coming from basketball practice. Please, just check my ID. Call my dad. We'll do the talking, Nolan interrupted, roughly patting down Jamal's pockets, pulling out his phone, his wallet, and the pack of gum. He tossed them onto the hood of the car. Nolan then grabbed Jamal's backpack, unzipping it and carelessly dumping its contents onto the sidewalk. The heavy AP Physics textbook hit the concrete with a loud thud, followed by his calculator and neatly organized folders. Look at this, Trent, Nolan mocked, kicking the textbook with his heavy boot. Kid's a real scholar. Probably stole the bag from one of the rich kids up the hill. Please, Jamal begged, the reality of his powerlessness setting in. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit sharply into his wrists, clicking tight, too tight. It sent a shooting pain up his forearms. You're making a mistake. My father, you don't want to do this. My father is Atamakisil. I don't care if your father is the president, Harlan hissed, leaning in close so Jamal could smell the stale coffee and tobacco on his breath. You don't dictate the terms here. You're a suspect in an attempted burglary. You're going downtown. They grabbed him by the collar of his expensive varsity jacket and shoved him roughly into the back of the cruiser. The plastic seat was hard and uncomfortable. The door slammed shut, trapping him in a dark, claustrophobic cage of wire and reinforced glass. Jamal leaned his head against the window, watching his school books and carefully written essay blow across the sidewalk in the wind as the cruiser pulled away. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping. He was terrified, but beneath that terror, a profound sense of injustice began to ignite. He knew something they didn't. He knew exactly who his father was. The ride to the 4th District Precinct was a silent nightmare. The officers in the front seat occasionally murmured to each other, laughing at private jokes, completely disregarding the traumatized teenager in the back. For Jamal, every turn of the car felt like a step further away from safety. He focused on his breathing, repeating his father's advice in his head. Stay calm. Assert your rights respectfully. Do not let them provoke you. The precinct was a stark contrast to the quiet wealth of Cedar Creek. It was a decaying concrete structure in the center of the city, reeking of floor wax, stale sweat, and cheap institutional coffee. As Harlan and Nolan hauled him through the double doors, Jamal felt the heavy stares of other officers and weary civilians. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow hue over the chaotic room. Desk Sergeant Grady barely looked up from his paperwork as they marched Jamal to the booking counter. Grady was a man completely desensitized to his environment, treating human beings like inventory numbers. What do we have here, Harlan? Grady asked, his voice bored, chewing on a matchstick. Caught a prowler up in the estates, Harlan announced loudly, puffing out his chest. Matched the description of the string of break-ins on Elm Street. Tried to give us some lip about living up there. Grady finally glanced up, his eyes sweeping over Jamal's bruised face, his torn varsity jacket, and the heavy chains around his wrists. Name? Jamal Carter, Jamal said, his voice remarkably steady despite the trembling of his hands. I am a minor. I demand my right to make a phone call to my parents immediately. You are holding me illegally, Nolan scoffed, slapping the back of Jamal's head lightly, a demeaning, disrespectful gesture. Listen to him using the big words. You've been watching too much television, kid. Put him in room 3, Harlan instructed, ignoring Jamal's request entirely. Let him sweat for a bit. I want to see if we can get a confession for the Elm Street jobs before we process him. They dragged him down a narrow, windowless hallway. The walls were painted a depressing institutional gray, scuffed with the marks of countless struggles. They shoved him into Interrogation Room 3, a small, suffocating box containing nothing but a bolted-down metal table and 3 hard chairs. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic clang that echoed in Jamal's chest. The deadbolt slid into place. Time stretched. Jamal sat there shivering slightly in the over-air-conditioned room. His wrists were throbbing, the metal cutting into his skin. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his stomach. He wasn't just a suspect. To them, he was a statistic, a stereotype they had projected onto him the moment they saw his skin color in that neighborhood. Nearly 45 minutes passed before the door opened again. Harlan and Nolan walked in, carrying steaming cups of coffee. They didn't offer him any water. They didn't remove the handcuffs. Harlan took the seat across from Jamal, leaning forward aggressively, while Nolan stood by the door, arms crossed. All right, Jamal, Harlan started, dropping a manila folder onto the table. It was likely empty, a classic interrogation prop. Here's how this is going to go. We know you were scoping out houses. We have a witness who saw someone matching your description jumping a fence 2 nights ago. I was at a debate tournament in Chicago 2 nights ago, Jamal stated clearly. I have plane tickets, hotel receipts, and 50 witnesses who can corroborate that. I haven't done anything wrong. I want my phone call, Nolan chuckled darkly. Kid thinks he's a lawyer. Look, make this easy on yourself. You confessed to the attempted B&E tonight. We put in a good word with the DA. You might just get probation. You keep playing games, we throw the book at you. Grand theft, trespassing, resisting arrest. I didn't resist, Jamal shot back, his anger finally bleeding through his fear. You assaulted me on the street. You threw my school books on the ground. And you are denying a minor his legal right to contact his guardian. Harlan slammed his fists onto the metal table, the loud bang making Jamal jump. You don't tell me what the law is, you little punk. I am the law in this room. You think because you talk proper and wear a fancy jacket that you're better than the thugs I deal with every day? You're nothing. You're a file on my desk. Jamal stared directly into Harlan's eyes. He didn't blink. My father is Judge Reginald Carter. Harlan paused, a slight frown creasing his forehead. He looked back at Nolan, who just shrugged. The name didn't register. To them, Reginald Carter was just another name. Good for Reginald, Harlan sneered. Is he going to come down here and bail you out with his landscaping money? Jamal felt a cold, hard knot of resolve tighten in his chest. Let me call him. Give me my phone and let me call him right now. Something in the boy's unwavering gaze made Harlan hesitate. He was used to suspects breaking, crying, or shouting. Jamal was unnervingly calm now, possessing a quiet authority that felt entirely out of place in a frightened teenager. Harlan sighed, running a hand over his face. Fine, Harlan barked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Jamal's cell phone, slamming it onto the table. You get 3 minutes, make it count, because after this you're going into holding. Jamal awkwardly maneuvered his handcuffed hands to pick up the device. He unlocked it with a bloody thumbprint and dialed the number he knew by heart. It rang twice. Jamal. The voice on the other end was deep, resonant, and commanded immediate respect. Dad, Jamal said, his voice finally breaking, the emotional dam cracking now that he heard his father's voice. Dad, I need help. Where are you? Are you hurt? The tone shifted instantly from warm to razor sharp. I'm at the 4th District Precinct. 2 officers. They arrested me walking home. They slammed me against the car, Dad. My wrists are bleeding. They won't take the cuffs off. There was a profound, chilling silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a hurricane gathering its strength. Who are the officers? Reginald asked, his voice deathly quiet. Jamal squinted, reading the silver nameplates on their chests. Officer Trent Harlan and Officer Bryce Nolan. I am on my way, Judge Reginald Carter said. The line went dead. Jamal set the phone down. Harlan smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. Daddy on his way. Good. We'll have a nice long chat with him about how he raised a criminal. Jamal looked at Harlan as a strange mixture of pity and anticipation in his eyes. You really shouldn't have done this. Reginald Carter was not a landscaper. He was the Honorable Reginald Carter, the Chief Judge of the State District Court. He was a man who had built his career tearing down corrupt systems and holding the powerful accountable. He was known in legal circles as a brilliant jurist, a man of unyielding integrity, and someone possessing a terrifyingly calm demeanor when angered. When Jamal's call came through, Reginald was in his chambers at the downtown courthouse. He had just finished presiding over a grueling late-night emergency injunction hearing regarding a high-stakes corporate fraud case. He was physically exhausted, rubbing his temples, preparing to change into his street clothes and head home. Then the phone rang. Listening to his son's trembling voice, hearing the words, "Slammed me against the car," and "wrists are bleeding," Reginald felt a primal, visceral rage ignite within his soul. He didn't waste a single second changing his clothes. He didn't grab his briefcase. He simply stood up, the heavy black silk of his judicial robe swirling around his ankles, and walked out of his chambers. He bypassed his security detail, marching directly to his car in the underground garage. He drove to the 4th District Precinct with a singular, terrifying focus. Back at the precinct, Officers Harlan and Nolan had left Jamal in the interrogation room to sweat. They were standing near the front desk drinking coffee and laughing with Sergeant Grady and a young rookie named Officer Pearson. "I'm telling you, the kid thought he was a lawyer," Nolan laughed, leaning against the counter. Talking about illegal detainment and his rights, they learn a few buzzwords on the internet and think they own the place. "Just process him. Let him sit in a cell overnight," Grady grunted, typing slowly on his keyboard. "Teach him a lesson about respect." "Did you get a hold of the parents?" Harlan asked, checking his watch. "Kid called his dad. Some guy named Reginald. Probably driving down here in a beat-up Civic to yell at us. I love it when the parents show up. I'll threaten to arrest the dad for obstructing justice if he gives me lip." The heavy, reinforced oak double doors of the precinct did not just open. They were thrust apart with violent authority. They slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack that made every officer in the room physically jump. The laughter died instantly. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The atmosphere in the room plummeted by 10 degrees. Standing in the doorway was a tall, imposing figure. He wasn't wearing a t-shirt. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was draped in the commanding, flowing black robe of a chief district judge. The overhead fluorescent lights seemed to catch the anger radiating from him. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. Every veteran officer in the room froze. Their blood ran cold. Sergeant Grady's jaw dropped, his matchstick falling from his lips onto the keyboard. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair backward. He knew exactly who was standing in his precinct. Every cop in the city knew Judge Carter. He was the judge who signed their warrants. He was the judge who mercilessly dismantled sloppy police work on the stand. He was the judge who had recently sentenced 3 corrupt vice detectives to federal prison. Your Honor," Grady stammered, his voice trembling, his hands instinctively dropping to his sides in a posture of complete submission. Harlan and Nolan turned around, their smug smiles slowly melting into expressions of profound confusion. They didn't recognize him immediately, but the black robe and the sheer aura of power emanating from the man made their police instincts scream that something was terribly wrong. "Which one of you," Reginald began, his voice not raised yet echoing off the concrete walls like thunder, "is Officer Trent Harlan, and which one is Officer Bryce Nolan?" Nolan swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Harlan. Harlan, trying to maintain his tough guy facade despite the sinking feeling in his gut, puffed his chest out slightly. "I'm Harlan. That's Nolan," Who wants to know? Grady looked like he was about to faint. Harlan, shut your mouth, he hissed frantically. That's Judge Carter. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Judge Carter. The color drained entirely from Trent Harlan's face. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sickening terror. He looked from the black robe to the furious eyes, and suddenly the pieces snapped together with bone-crushing clarity. Jamal Carter. I am Reginald Carter, the judge stated, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a death sentence. He closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches from Harlan. Harlan, despite being a large man, seemed to shrink under the immense pressure of the judge's presence. And you, Reginald said, pointing a finger that felt like a loaded weapon directly at Harlan's chest. Have my son chained to a table in a back room. Your Honor, we... Nolan started, stepping backward, his hands raised defensively. We received a call. A suspect matching his description. Do not insult my intelligence with your fabricated probable cause. Reginald snapped, his voice sharp as a razor. My son is a 16-year-old honor student who is walking home in his own neighborhood. You assaulted him. You illegally detained him, and you denied him his right to counsel. Reginald turned his piercing gaze to Sergeant Grady, who was sweating profusely. Sergeant, you have exactly 30 seconds to produce my son. If he is not standing in front of me, unrestrained, by the time I finish counting, I will have the FBI field office down here. I will personally see to it that this precinct is under federal investigation by morning, and I will strip every single one of you of your badges before the sun comes up. Get the keys! Grady screamed at Nolan, completely losing his composure. Get the damn keys right now! Get the boy! Nolan practically tripped over his own feet, sprinting down the hallway toward Interrogation Room 3, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled for his key ring. Harlan remained frozen, trapped under the paralyzing stare of Judge Carter. He had spent his entire career bullying those he deemed powerless. For the first time in his life, he was staring into the face of absolute power, and he knew with terrifying certainty that his career was already over. Your Honor, please understand, Harlan tried to whisper, his voice cracking, the tough guy persona shattered into a million pieces. It was a misunderstanding. It's dark out there. Reginald leaned in closer. His voice was a dangerous, quiet rumble. You didn't make a mistake, Officer Harlan. You made a choice. You looked at my son and you saw prey. But you chose the wrong boy. And I am going to make an example out of you that this department will never, ever forget. Footsteps echoed rapidly down the hall. Nolan emerged, looking pale and sick to his stomach, followed by Jamal. Jamal was rubbing his wrists, the skin raw and bleeding where the cuffs had dug in. He looked exhausted, but seeing his father standing there in his full judicial regalia, commanding the room like a king holding court, a small, weary smile touched his lips. Reginald's severe expression instantly softened. He rushed past the terrified officers, enveloping his son in a tight embrace, uncaring of the dirt and blood getting on his silk robe. I've got you, Jamal. You're safe now, Reginald whispered fiercely into his son's ear. He pulled back, inspecting the raw, bleeding skin on Jamal's wrists. The sight of the injuries erased any lingering trace of mercy Reginald might have possessed. He turned slowly back to face the room. The officers took a collective step back. The judge didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply looked at Harlan and Nolan with a gaze so cold it could freeze boiling water. Sergeant Grady, Reginald said, his voice deadly calm. I want the badge numbers of these two men. I want the dash cam footage from their cruiser, the body cam footage, which I pray to God they didn't accidentally turn off during the time of the arrest. And I want the full precinct security logs impounded immediately. You will place them both on an administrative leave without pay, effective this exact second. Harlan opened his mouth to protest, but a single lethal glare from Reginald shut him up instantly. This isn't over, Reginald promised, his voice echoing in the silent precinct. "This is just the arraignment. The trial is going to destroy you." He wrapped his arm protectively around his son's shoulders and guided him toward the heavy oak doors, leaving behind a room of grown men paralyzed by the devastating consequences of their own ignorance. The doors swung shut behind them, sealing the officers inside the tomb of their ruined careers. The ride back to the affluent enclave of Cedar Creek was enveloped in a heavy, suffocating silence. Jamal sat in the passenger seat of his father's sedan, staring blankly at the passing streetlights. The adrenaline had finally drained from his system, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion and a terrifying vulnerability. He looked down at his wrists, now wrapped in white gauze from the first aid kit his father kept in the trunk. The physical pain was sharp, but the psychological wound, the sudden, violent realization that his neighborhood, his achievements, and his innocence offered zero protection against a badge and a bias, cut infinitely deeper. Reginald Carter drove, with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His face was carved from granite. He was not just a father comforting his traumatized son. He was a master tactician surveying a battlefield. By the time he pulled into their driveway, the blueprint for absolute destruction had already been drafted in his mind. "Go inside, take a hot shower, try to sleep," Reginald said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle as he turned off the ignition. "Your mother is waiting for you." "What are you going to do, Dad?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reginald looked at his son, his eyes dark and resolute. "I'm going to do my job, Jamal. I'm going to ensure those men never wear a uniform again." The moment Reginald walked into his home office, the judge vanished and the executioner took over. He bypassed the local precinct entirely, knowing the blue wall of silence would immediately begin laying bricks to protect Harlan and Nolan. Instead, Reginald picked up his encrypted phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. The personal cell phone of Sarah Jenkins, the special agent in charge of the FBI's Civil Rights Division for the district. By 2 a.m., the wheels of a federal investigation were already turning silently in the dark. The next morning, the pushback began exactly as Reginald had anticipated. At 8:30 a.m., Reginald's office phone rang. It was Captain Reynolds, the precinct commander of the 4th District. "Judge Carter, Reginald, listen, I wanted to reach out personally," Reynolds began, his tone dripping with forced camaraderie and desperate damage control. "What happened last night was a colossal misunderstanding. My guys were on edge. We've had a rash of burglaries." "Captain Reynolds," Reginald interrupted, his voice slicing through the phone line like a scalpel. "Are you calling to inform me that officers Harlan and Nolan have been terminated?" "Well, now, Reginald, you know there's a process, the police union." "Then you and I have nothing to discuss," Reginald stated coldly. "Do not contact my office or my family again unless it is through your legal counsel." "Oh, and Captain, I expect the dash cam and body cam footage on my desk by noon." Reginald hung up. He knew what was coming next. At 11:45 a.m., a courier delivered a manila envelope from the precinct. Inside was a sworn affidavit signed by the precinct's IT director, stating that due to a corrupted hard drive sector, the dash cam footage from Harlan's cruiser had been irretrievably lost, and both officers had allegedly experienced battery failures with their body cameras during the time of the arrest. It was the oldest, dirtiest trick in the book. It was an insult to Reginald's intelligence. When Reginald brought the news home that evening, Jamal was sitting at the kitchen table icing his swollen cheek. The teenager listened to the blatant lie about the cameras, a bitter smile crossing his face. "They think they're smart," Jamal said, shaking his head. He pulled his laptop toward him and opened a map of his walking route from the night before. "Dad, they stopped me on the corner of Elm and Maplewood, right?" "Yes," Reginald nodded, leaning over his son's shoulder. "Look who lives on that corner." Jamal pointed to a massive gated property on the map. David Whitmore, the CEO of Sentinel Tech. His entire property perimeter is rigged with 4K resolution night vision security cameras. He sponsors my basketball team. I guarantee you his cameras cover the sidewalk all the way down the block. Reginald felt a cold, predatory smile spread across his face. The officers thought they had controlled the narrative by wiping their own devices. They had completely forgotten the neighborhood they were terrorizing. 30 minutes later, Reginald was sitting in David Whitmore's expansive home theater room. The tech billionaire, appalled by the story, had his security team pull the archived footage. There it was in stark, unforgiving high-definition black and white. The video showed Jamal walking peacefully. It showed the cruiser violently jumping the curb, the blinding spotlight, Harlan throwing Jamal against the hood unprovoked, the illegal search, the dumping of the backpack, and the painful, aggressive handcuffing. There was no resisting. There was no prowling. It was a textbook, undeniable case of assault under the color of law. Reginald asked for a copy on an encrypted drive. He didn't take it to the press. He didn't take it to the local district attorney. He drove it straight to the FBI field office and handed it to Agent Sarah Jenkins. "Seal the exit, Sarah," Reginald told her as she watched the footage, her face tightening in disgust. "I don't just want their badges. I want their freedom." By Monday morning, the atmosphere in the city was crackling with invisible tension. Word had leaked through the courthouse grapevine that Judge Carter was on a warpath against the 4th District, though the specifics remained shrouded. The Police Benevolent Association, sensing a catastrophic PR disaster, decided to strike first. They hired Bradley Sinclair, a slick, aggressive defense attorney known for getting dirty cops acquitted by dragging victims through the mud. Sinclair immediately called a press conference on the steps of the precinct. "My clients, Officers Trent Harlan and Bryce Nolan, are decorated public servants who put their lives on the line daily," Sinclair boomed into the microphones, his face a mask of manufactured outrage. "They are currently the victims of a political witch hunt orchestrated by a powerful judge abusing his authority to protect his son. We have reason to believe the minor in question was involved in illicit activities, and we demand an independent investigation into Judge Carter's blatant conflict of interest and obstruction of justice." It was a gross, calculated smear campaign. They were trying to paint Jamal as a thug and Reginald as corrupt, relying on the public's inherent bias to carry the lie. Watching the broadcast in his chambers, Reginald remained perfectly still. His clerks expected him to throw a chair or call his own press conference. Instead, Reginald simply picked up his pen and signed a massive 70-page federal civil rights lawsuit against the city, the police department, and the individual officers. Concurrently, the Department of Justice, armed with the Whitmore footage, quietly convened a grand jury. While Harlan strutted around the precinct, treating his administrative leave like a paid vacation and boasting about how his union lawyer was going to destroy the arrogant judge, Officer Bryce Nolan was rapidly unraveling. Nolan was younger. He had a mortgage he couldn't afford, a newborn baby, and a fragile marriage that was buckling under the intense public scrutiny. Unlike Harlan, who was a true believer in his own untouchability, Nolan knew exactly who Reginald Carter was, and the sheer terror of federal prison was keeping him awake at night, vomiting into his bathroom sink. The turning point came when Agent Jenkins from the FBI accidentally bumped into Nolan at a grocery store far outside his jurisdiction. She didn't threaten him. She simply handed him a plain envelope. Inside were high-resolution stills from the Whitmore security camera. It showed Nolan clearly kicking Jamal's schoolbooks. It showed him participating in the illegal search. But the final piece of paper was the most devastating. It was a draft of a federal indictment for deprivation of rights under color of law, carrying a potential sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. His name was right at the top alongside Harlan's. "The train is leaving the station, Bryce," Agent Jenkins whispered, standing by the produce section. "Harlan is going to use you as a human shield. Sinclair works for the union, not you. If you want to see your daughter grow up outside of a visitation room, you need to be in my office at 8 a.m. tomorrow. We want the ROT. All of it." The blue wall of silence is impenetrable until self-preservation kicks in. Then it crumbles like dry sand. The next morning, Bryce Nolan walked into the FBI field office, his face pale, his hands shaking. He sat down with federal prosecutors and spilled everything. He didn't just talk about Jamal's arrest. To save his own skin, Nolan opened Pandora's box. He detailed a horrific 3-year history of Trent Harlan's abuses. He testified about Harlan routinely targeting minorities in affluent neighborhoods. He testified about illegal searches, fabricated probable cause, and the systemic falsification of police reports. But the final nail in the coffin, the twist that elevated the case from a single civil rights violation to a massive federal racketeering charge, was Nolan's confession about the drop gear. "Harlan has a false bottom in his secondary locker at the precinct," Nolan confessed, his voice breaking, wiping tears from his eyes. "He keeps unregistered firearms, bags of narcotics, and stolen jewelry in there. When he needs to justify a bad stop or when someone fights back, he plants it. He told me to find something in the Carter kid's backpack. When I didn't, he was furious. He was planning to plant a bag of meth on the kid if the judge hadn't shown up." When Reginald received the call from Agent Jenkins detailing Nolan's confession, a cold shiver ran down his spine. His intervention hadn't just saved his son from an unjust arrest. He had literally saved Jamal from being framed for a felony that would have destroyed his entire future. The fury Reginald felt was no longer just a burning fire. It was a cold, absolute zero. The hammer was ready to fall. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. The 4th District Precinct was operating as usual, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and cynical humor. Trent Harlan was standing by the sergeant's desk in plain clothes, laughing loudly about a golf game he had played while on paid leave. He was convinced the storm had blown over, that the union had successfully intimidated the judge into backing down. Then, the heavy oak doors of the precinct opened. This time, it wasn't a solitary judge in a black robe. It was 24 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with large yellow FBI letters stamped across their backs. They moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. The chatter in the precinct died instantly, replaced by the heavy thud of tactical boots. "Federal warrant. Nobody move. Hands away from your keyboards," the lead agent barked, flashing a badge. Harlan dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the linoleum, the brown liquid pooling around his expensive shoes. He watched in absolute paralyzed horror as 4 armed federal agents marched directly toward him. "Trent Harlan," an agent said, his voice void of any emotion. "You're under arrest for federal civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." "What? You can't do this. I'm a cop. Call Sinclair!" Harlan screamed, the tough guy facade finally shattering, replaced by the panicked screech of a cornered animal. They didn't listen. They spun him around, and for the first time in his adult life, Trent Harlan felt the cold, unforgiving bite of steel handcuffs clamping tightly around his own wrists. The agents pulled his arms up sharply, forcing him to bend forward slightly, the exact same maneuver he had used on countless innocent people, including Jamal. Simultaneously, a separate team of agents marched straight into the locker room. They bypassed the standard locks, brought in a breaching tool, and ripped the metal door of Harlan's secondary locker off its hinges. They found the false bottom exactly where Nolan had said it would be. As agents pulled out unregistered throwaway weapons and baggies of crystallized narcotics, sealing them in evidence bags, The remaining officers in the precinct watched their careers flash before their eyes. The corruption was out in the open, undeniable and utterly damning. 4 months later, the federal courthouse was packed to maximum capacity. The air was thick with anticipation. Reginald Carter was not on the bench today. He was sitting in the front row of the gallery, shoulder to shoulder with Jamal. Jamal looked sharp in a tailored charcoal suit, his head held high, his wounds healed, but his spirit permanently altered, hardened by the reality of the world. At the defense table sat Trent Harlan. He was unrecognizable. The swagger was gone. He looked 10 years older, his skin sallow, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was wearing a drab, ill-fitting prison jumpsuit, having been denied bail due to his attempts to intimidate witnesses prior to the trial. His union lawyer, Bradley Sinclair, sat beside him, looking defeated. The mountain of evidence, combined with Nolan's devastating testimony, made the case utterly unwinnable. The federal judge presiding over the case, an old colleague of Reginald's known for his lack of mercy toward corrupt officials, glared down from the bench. "Trent Harlan," the presiding judge's voice echoed through the cavernous room. "You were entrusted with a badge, a gun, and the sacred duty to protect the public. Instead, you used that power to terrorize, to frame, and to brutalize those you deemed vulnerable. You infected the justice system with a rot so deep it is a miracle a young man like Jamal Carter survived your encounter with his future intact." Harlan kept his head down, staring at the scarred wooden table, his hands trembling. "The evidence presented here, particularly the terrifying reality of your drop gear, shows you are not a rogue cop. You are a criminal masquerading as a public servant," the judge continued. "Therefore, on the counts of deprivation of civil rights, conspiracy to commit evidence tampering, and federal racketeering, I sentence you to 22 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. 22 years for a former cop. It was effectively a death sentence. The reality of his absolute destruction crashed down on Harlan. His knees buckled and he let out a pathetic, gut-wrenching sob, collapsing into his chair before the federal marshals yanked him roughly to his feet. As the marshals dragged Harlan down the center aisle, his eyes desperately scanned the crowd until they locked onto Reginald and Jamal. Reginald did not smile. He did not gloat. He looked at the ruined man with the cold, detached satisfaction of a surgeon who had successfully excised a tumor. Jamal, however, held Harlan's gaze directly. The teenager who had been crying on the hood of a police car was gone. In his place was a young man who had learned the true mechanics of power and justice. Bryce Nolan, having accepted a plea deal for his cooperation, was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility and permanently stripped of his right to work in law enforcement or security anywhere in the United States. The 4th District Precinct was placed under federal monitorship, leading to the forced resignation of Captain Reynolds and the dismissal of a dozen other officers implicated in Harlan's web of corruption. Karma had not merely visited Trent Harlan. It had kicked down his door, dragged him into the street, and dismantled his life piece by agonizing piece. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was blindingly bright. Reginald put a heavy, reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Is it over?" Jamal asked, adjusting his tie, watching the news van scramble for position. "For him?" "Yes," Reginald replied, his voice a low rumble. "But for us, Jamal, it's just a reminder. The system isn't going to fix itself. It only works when we force it to." They turned their backs on the cameras and walked down the marble steps together, leaving the wreckage of corrupt men far behind them. 7 years later, the heavy oak doors of the state Supreme Court swung open. But this time it wasn't to signal the arrival of an angry father. It was to welcome a new generation of justice. Jamal Carter walked through the marble corridors, the sharp click of his dress shoes echoing with purpose. He was no longer the terrified 16-year-old boy bleeding onto the hood of a police cruiser. At 23, he had grown into a formidable, brilliant young man. He had graduated at the top of his class from Georgetown Law, fueled by a relentless burning fire that had been ignited on the cold concrete of Elm Street. The multi-million-dollar settlement he had won in the civil rights lawsuit against the city didn't go to luxury cars or sprawling estates. He had quietly poured every single cent of it into establishing a non-profit legal defense fund dedicated to investigating wrongful convictions. Jamal had taken the trauma of his past and forged it into a weapon for the defenseless. During his law school tenure, he had aggressively sought out real-world mentorship, refusing to be confined to theoretical classroom debates. He spent his summers in Montgomery, Alabama, working tirelessly under the direct guidance of legendary real-life civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative. Working alongside Stevenson, a man who had dedicated his life to defending the poor, the incarcerated, and the wrongly condemned, Jamal learned how to dismantle corrupt systems from the inside out. He learned that the law was only as just as the people wielding it. But Jamal's ultimate masterpiece of justice, the true devastating twist of karma, was a project he called the 4th District Audit. Using his new foundation's resources and partnering with the National Innocence Project, Jamal led a team of paralegals and law students in a forensic teardown of every single arrest ever made by Officer Trent Harlan and Officer Bryce Nolan. If Harlan had a false bottom in his locker for Jamal, he had used it on others. Jamal was determined to find them. For 2 years, Jamal dug through the archives. He found the inconsistencies. He found the fabricated probable causes. He found the men who didn't have a wealthy, powerful judge for a father to swoop in and save them. He found the voiceless victims who had been bullied into accepting plea deals for crimes they never committed, just to avoid the draconian sentences Harlan had threatened them with. 300 miles away, inside the bleak, heavily fortified walls of the Marion United States Penitentiary, Trent Harlan sat in the prison cafeteria, a shadow of the arrogant predator he used to be. His hair had thinned and turned entirely gray. His posture was permanently stooped. Every day was a masterclass in fear. As a former cop in a maximum security federal facility, he lived in constant paralyzing paranoia, confined to a protective custody wing where his only interactions were with other disgraced officials and violent offenders who despised him. One bleak Tuesday morning, a prison guard carelessly tossed the daily newspaper onto Harlan's metal table. Harlan glanced at the front page, and the last shred of his sanity completely unraveled. Staring back at him in high-definition color was a photograph of Jamal Carter standing confidently on the courthouse steps. The headline above the photo read, "Young Attorney Dismantles Corrupt Cop's Legacy. 14 Wrongful Convictions Overturned." As Harlan read the article, his hands began to shake violently. Jamal hadn't just put him in prison. Jamal was systematically erasing his entire career. The young man was legally representing the very people Harlan had framed, using the drop gear scandal to completely invalidate decades of Harlan's police work. The city was hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars in restitution payouts. Harlan's pension had been seized. His wife had divorced him. His friends had abandoned him. And now the teenager he had assaulted on a quiet suburban street was being hailed as a national hero for freeing the innocent men Harlan had buried. It was a psychological torment worse than any physical cage. Harlan realized with crushing finality that he would not be remembered as a tough cop. He would go down in history exclusively as the villain in Jamal Carter's origin story. He dropped his head onto the cold metal table and wept, entirely broken, surrounded by the ghosts of his own hubris. Back in the city, the courtroom was packed. Jamal stood behind the defense table adjusting his tie. Beside him sat Marcus Johnson, a 30-year-old man who had spent 6 years in state prison for a narcotics charge after Harlan had planted evidence in his vehicle during a routine traffic stop. Today was Marcus's exoneration hearing. Sitting up high on the bench, presiding over the hearing, was Chief Judge Reginald Carter. Reginald looked down at his son. The pride swelling in his chest was indescribable. He maintained his stoic judicial composure, but a profound, silent communication passed between them. They had fought the beast together, and they had won. "Counselor Carter," Reginald said, his resonant voice filling the quiet courtroom, "you may proceed with your motion." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice steady, carrying the exact same quiet, lethal authority his father possessed. The defense moves to vacate the conviction of Marcus Johnson with prejudice, citing irrefutable, newly discovered evidence of systemic police misconduct, evidence tampering, and perjury committed by the arresting officer Trent Harlan. Jamal didn't just present the facts. He told Marcus his story. He spoke of the stolen years, the shattered family, and the terrifying reality of being powerless against a badge. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had felt the cold bite of those handcuffs. 10 minutes later, the gavel fell with a resounding crack. "Motion granted," Judge Carter declared. "Mr. Johnson, you are a free man. This court deeply apologizes for the profound failure of justice you have endured." Tears streamed down Marcus's face as he pulled Jamal into a bone-crushing hug. The gallery erupted in applause. Jamal hugged him back, looking over Marcus's shoulder directly at his father. Reginald gave a slow, respectful nod. The story of the arrogant officers who thought they could detain a black kid for walking in the wrong neighborhood didn't end in tragedy. It ended in a revolution. They thought they were stopping a prowler. Instead, they accidentally forged the greatest civil rights attorney their city had ever seen. The badges lost, the robes won, and justice, though blind, proved it still carried a remarkably heavy sword. What an absolutely incredible true-to-life journey of power, karma, and ultimate redemption. If Jamal's story of turning deep trauma into a life-saving mission for justice gave you goosebumps, you need to be part of our community. Cases like this happen in the shadows every single day, and it is up to us to shine a massive spotlight on them. We bring you the most intense, jaw-dropping stories of real-life karma, legal battles, and the triumph of the human spirit. Don't let this story stop here. Hit that like button right now to show your support for those fighting against corruption. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who needs a powerful reminder that justice always strikes back. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling story. Stand with us. Spread the word.